So, what happened this afternoon wasn't just another headline, it was the kind of moment that quietly ends an entire era. Federal authorities stepped in and took control of Mar-a-Lago, not as a symbolic warning, not as political theater, but as a direct consequence of unpaid court judgments that had finally crossed a point of no return. Court-appointed receivers arrived at the property with legal authority to assume operational control of what has long been considered the crown jewel of Trump's empire, his most iconic asset, his personal residence, and the symbolic nerve center of his business world. This wasn't sudden, and it definitely wasn't accidental. Trump currently faces judgments totaling $540 million, roughly $450 million from the New York civil fraud ruling and another $90 million stemming from defamation verdicts. Those debts remained unpaid. Creditors waited. Deadlines passed. Appeals were filed, but crucially, no bonds were posted. Without those bonds, the law allows enforcement to move forward immediately, appeal or not. At that point, patience ends and enforcement begins. Creditors didn't ask politely anymore. They demanded satisfaction, and when liquid cash wasn't available, they turned to the only thing left that could realistically cover a judgment of that size: assets. Mar-a-Lago stood out instantly, not because it's emotional, not because it's political, but because it's valuable, identifiable, and sellable. This is the brutal logic of creditor enforcement. When someone owes hundreds of millions and can't pay voluntarily, the system doesn't nibble at the edges. It goes straight for the largest, most valuable piece on the board. The property that can generate the fastest and biggest recovery becomes the first target. And that's exactly why Mar-a-Lago fell first. Receivers didn't arrive like police kicking down doors. They arrived like accountants with court orders, calm, procedural, and final. These are professionals whose job is to take over distressed assets, stabilize them, and prepare them for sale under court supervision. They don't negotiate narratives, they execute orders. The paperwork was clear. Operational control transferred immediately. Financial authority transferred immediately. Management authority transferred immediately. Trump, legally speaking, no longer controlled anything inside those gates. Staff were informed that reporting lines had changed. Club operations, memberships, bookings, payroll, all of it now fell under receiver authority. Any revenue generated from that moment forward would no longer flow to Trump or his organization. It would flow directly toward satisfying court judgments. And then came the part that made this different from every other asset seizure. Trump was required to leave. Mar-a-Lago wasn't just a club. It wasn't just a brand backdrop. It was also his home. The court order didn't carve out a sentimental exception. The receiver's authority extended to the residential portions of the property as well. Trump was given limited time to remove personal belongings, but the message was unmistakable. He could not remain living there while the property was under receivership. This is where the story stops being about real estate and starts being about collapse. Losing an office building hurts, losing a golf course stings. But being forced out of your primary residence by creditors enforcing judgments you couldn't pay is something else entirely. It's not a restructuring. It's not a setback. It's displacement. Members of the private club were notified almost immediately. Communications went out explaining that Mar-a-Lago was now being operated under court-appointed receivership, that memberships remained valid for the time being, but that all dues and correspondence would now be directed to the receivers, not Trump, not the Trump Organization. In one afternoon, the relationship between Trump and the property that defined his public image for decades was severed. From a legal standpoint, this outcome was predictable. Creditors argued that Mar-a-Lago could not be shielded under Florida's homestead protections because it functions as a commercial enterprise, a private club that generates revenue, hosts events, employs staff, and operates as a business. Courts agreed. Commercial use defeated residential protection. That single ruling unlocked everything that followed. And once that door opened, there was no mechanism left to stop what came next. The receivers immediately began the next phase: valuation, assessment, and preparation for forced sale. Appraisals, financial audits, auction timelines. The goal is simple: maximize recovery for creditors, not preserve legacy or image. This is where something deeper becomes impossible to ignore. Because when Mar-a-Lago falls, it isn't just an asset being liquidated. It's the center of gravity disappearing. This property wasn't one of many interchangeable holdings. It was the visual shorthand for Trump's wealth, power, and permanence. The place where he hosted, commanded, projected strength. The place that symbolized success even when other ventures struggled. And now, it's under someone else's control. That's why this moment lands differently. Because what's happening here isn't isolated. It's structural. When debts exceed liquid assets by hundreds of millions, the system doesn't stop after one seizure. It continues, methodically, legally, relentlessly. And that's where a certain warning, famously repeated for decades by Warren Buffett, suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. Because when leverage builds an empire, leverage can also erase it, faster than anyone expects. This is exactly where Warren Buffett's warning stops sounding theoretical and starts looking like a live case study unfolding in real time. Buffett has spent more than 7 decades watching empires rise and fall, and his core observation has never changed. Leverage doesn't just amplify success, it amplifies failure with the same force. The problem isn't ambition. The problem is building dominance on borrowed money while assuming nothing will ever force repayment all at once. And that assumption is what just collapsed. Real estate empires look indestructible during good times. Properties appreciate. Revenue flows. Debt feels manageable because asset values appear higher than liabilities. On paper, everything works. But paper wealth and liquid reality are not the same thing, and courts don't accept optimism as payment. The moment 540 million in enforceable judgments hit simultaneously, the illusion cracked. Judgments aren't like business loans. They don't wait for favorable market conditions. They don't renegotiate based on brand value. They demand payment now. And when payment doesn't come, creditors are legally empowered to take whatever satisfies the obligation fastest. This is where real estate becomes uniquely vulnerable. Real estate is illiquid by nature. Even the most valuable property can't be converted into cash overnight without severe discounts. But judgments are liquid obligations. They are due regardless of market timing, valuation disputes, or personal narratives. That mismatch, illiquid assets versus liquid debts, is where leverage turns deadly. Buffett has explained this repeatedly using simple math. If you control a $10 million property with only $1 million of your own equity and $9 million in debt, a 10% drop in value doesn't hurt. It annihilates you. Your equity disappears completely, and anything beyond that puts you underwater. The same leverage that multiplied gains on the way up vaporizes ownership on the way down. Now scale that logic to an empire. When judgments exceed liquid assets by hundreds of millions, there is no graceful unwinding. There is only liquidation. And liquidation doesn't start with the weakest properties, it starts with the strongest. Creditors don't care which asset is emotionally significant, they care which asset generates the most recovery with the least friction. That's why the crown jewel always falls first. It sends a message, not just to the debtor, but to every other creditor watching closely. Mar-a-Lago wasn't seized because it was symbolic. It became symbolic because it was seized. Once that property fell, every remaining illusion of untouchability collapsed with it. Buffett has pointed out something else that matters here. Wealth that cannot be mobilized when obligations come due is not real wealth in any practical sense. You can claim billions on a balance sheet, but if you can't post a bond, can't write a check, and can't prevent enforcement, then solvency doesn't exist, only delay. Trump's inability to secure bonds during appeal wasn't a technical hiccup. It was a signal. Bond underwriters didn't accept real estate valuations as collateral because forced sale value is what matters, not theoretical peak pricing. And forced sale value is always lower, often dramatically lower. That's why appeals didn't pause enforcement. Without bonds, the law assumes creditors should not be forced to wait while assets potentially deteriorate or disappear. From that moment on, seizure became inevitable. And once Mar-a-Lago entered receivership, the dominoes didn't just line up, they started falling. Because every creditor now understands something crucial. If the crown jewel can be taken, nothing else is protected. Golf courses, commercial buildings, licensing operations, residences held personally rather than through entities, aircraft, vehicles, collectibles, revenue streams. Everything becomes fair game when judgments remain unsatisfied, and courts have already demonstrated willingness to authorize seizure. This is how empire collapse actually happens, not through one dramatic explosion, but through a controlled, relentless dismantling. Receivers don't destroy assets emotionally, they neutralize them financially. They step in, strip authority, redirect revenue, stabilize operations, and prepare assets for sale. Every dollar generated moves toward judgment satisfaction. Every decision is made with creditor recovery in mind, not legacy, not branding, not reputation. And the psychological impact of this matters more than people realize. When the symbolic headquarters falls, confidence evaporates. Business partners panic. Lenders reassess exposure. Vendors demand payment upfront or walk away entirely. Employees sense instability and exit. Licenses get terminated. Joint ventures dissolve. What looked like a powerful organization suddenly feels hollow. Buffett has described this moment as the instant the center collapses. Once that happens, recovery becomes nearly impossible. Not because rebuilding is theoretically impossible, but because the conditions that allowed the empire to exist no longer exist. No credit, no liquidity, no control, no confidence, and crucially, no time. Because forced sales don't maximize value, they maximize speed. Auction dynamics favor buyers who know sellers are desperate. Discounts of 20, 30, even 40% from appraised value are normal. That means more assets must be sold to cover the same obligations, and every sale weakens what remains. This is why Mar-a-Lago isn't the end. It's the signal. The signal that systematic liquidation has begun. The signal that the empire isn't shrinking, it's being unwound. And once that process starts, it doesn't pause for reputation, politics, or nostalgia. It only stops when the judgments are satisfied or when there's nothing left to take. Once Mar-a-Lago fell, the collapse stopped being theoretical and started becoming mechanical. This is the phase most people misunderstand. Empires don't collapse because one asset is lost. They collapse because control disappears faster than assets can be defended. And receivership is the mechanism that accelerates that loss of control. Court-appointed receivers don't just watch properties, they replace ownership authority entirely. That means Trump Organization staff no longer take instructions from Trump. Financial decisions no longer align with long-term branding. Every move is evaluated through a single lens. How much money can this asset generate for creditors right now? That shift alone changes everything. Revenue that once funded operations, legal defenses, maintenance, and expansion is immediately redirected. Cash flow dries up where it's needed most. And when cash flow dries up, everything downstream starts breaking. Golf courses are the next obvious targets. Not because they're glamorous, but because they're structured exactly like Mar-a-Lago. High-value real estate, ongoing business operations, predictable revenue, and clear ownership structures. Once courts demonstrate willingness to place one flagship property into receivership, extending that logic to other properties becomes routine. Receivers step in. Management changes overnight. Membership revenue stops flowing to Trump. Vendors renegotiate or exit. Maintenance budgets get slashed to preserve cash for creditors. Long-term brand damage becomes irrelevant because receivers aren't preserving an empire. They're harvesting it. And here's where the cascade accelerates. Banks don't wait politely when they see seizures begin. Loan agreements almost always contain clauses allowing lenders to demand immediate repayment if the borrower experiences material financial distress or asset seizure. That means outstanding mortgages suddenly come due. If they can't be paid, foreclosure follows, fast. Vendors do the same thing. Suppliers who once extended generous payment terms tighten instantly or cut ties entirely. Lawsuits for unpaid balances start appearing. Each lawsuit creates another judgment. Each judgment creates another creditor with legal standing to seize assets. Employees feel it before anyone else. When payroll becomes uncertain, talent leaves. When leadership disappears, morale collapses. When properties shift into receivership, thousands of workers find themselves employed by strangers whose only mandate is cost control. Layoffs aren't emotional decisions. They're efficiency decisions. And that human cost multiplies the financial damage. Because former employees don't just leave, they file claims. Unpaid wages, unpaid severance, contract violations. Those claims join the creditor pile. The pile grows. The pressure compounds. Meanwhile, licensing partners begin pulling away. Trump's brand licensing model depended on perception of strength, permanence, and prestige. Licensing contracts typically include termination clauses triggered by reputational harm or financial instability. Once the seizures start, those clauses activate. Branding disappears from buildings. Royalty payments stop. Entire revenue streams vanish overnight. What looked like diversification suddenly reveals itself as dependency. Joint ventures unravel next. Partners who once benefited from association with Trump now rush to legally separate their interests before creditors can reach shared assets. Courts get flooded with dissolution motions, projects freeze, developments stall. Everything that requires cooperation collapses under mistrust. This is what Buffett meant when he said leverage creates fragility. It's not just the debt itself, it's how debt turns time into an enemy. When everything is leveraged, nothing can wait. And when nothing can wait, mistakes multiply faster than they can be corrected. Trump's claimed wealth becomes irrelevant at this stage. On paper, the portfolio might still look massive, but paper doesn't pay judgments. Liquidity does. And liquidity is exactly what forced sales destroy. Every auction converts potential value into discounted cash. And once that cash is gone, the asset is gone forever. There is no rewind button. This is also why creditors pile on once the first major seizure succeeds. They understand momentum. They understand that early movers recover more. Late movers risk getting nothing. So enforcement accelerates, not slows. Multiple actions run simultaneously. Multiple courts. Multiple receivers. Multiple sales. Defense becomes impossible. You can't negotiate with everyone when you have nothing left to offer except assets already being seized. You can't refinance when lenders see liquidation in progress. You can't restructure when cash flow is being intercepted at the source. At this point, collapse stops being about failure and starts being about math. Judgments exceed liquid assets. Forced sales generate less than market value. Discounts require more assets to be sold. More sales reduce revenue. Reduced revenue triggers more defaults. It's a closed loop, and it only runs in one direction. This is why Buffett avoids leverage so aggressively, not because it never works, but because when it fails completely, slowly on the way up, suddenly on the way down. Mar-a-Lago was the psychological breaking point, but operationally, it was just the beginning. Because once the center collapses, the outer structure doesn't stand. It caves inward. And that brings us to the final question. What's left when the crown jewel is gone, control is lost, and liquidation becomes the governing principle? This is where the story stops being about Trump as an individual and becomes a case study in how empires actually die. Not with chaos, not with drama, but with paperwork. By the time Mar-a-Lago entered receivership, the outcome was already mathematically locked in. The remaining questions were no longer if the empire would collapse, but how completely and how fast. Once liquidation becomes the governing principle, everything else becomes secondary. Brand doesn't matter. History doesn't matter. Symbolism doesn't matter. Courts don't preserve legacy. They satisfy judgments. Every asset that can be seized will be identified. Every asset that can be sold will be sold. Every dollar recovered will be distributed to creditors. And whatever remains afterward, if anything remains at all, is not an empire. It's residue. This is why losing Mar-a-Lago wasn't just losing a property. It was losing the last illusion that control still existed. Without the crown jewel, there is no center. Without liquidity, there is no defense. Without confidence, there is no rebuilding. Even if some properties technically remain in Trump's name after liquidation, they won't function as an empire. They'll be isolated assets surrounded by legal pressure, declining revenue, and reputational collapse. No leverage, no expansion, no cohesion. That's the difference between survival and existence. Survival requires momentum. Existence is just delay, and delay is all leverage ever really buys. Warren Buffett's warning wasn't moral. It was mechanical. When debt exceeds assets and obligations come due all at once, the system doesn't negotiate. It executes. Crown jewels fall first. Then everything else follows until the numbers balance. Mar-a-Lago's seizure was that execution moment. The personal residence gone. The symbolic headquarters gone. the most valuable branded asset gone. At that point, rebuilding isn't just difficult, it's functionally impossible, because the conditions that created the empire no longer exist, and the tools needed to rebuild, credit, trust, time, liquidity, have all been stripped away. What remains is not a comeback story, it's a liquidation timeline. And that's why this moment doesn't depend on what happens next in court, or in politics, or in headlines. The ending is already written in enforcement orders and auction schedules. When leverage builds the empire, leverage also decides how it ends quietly, legally, irreversibly. This wasn't a setback. This wasn't a warning. This was the end.